Shweta is a data scientist at BlueLabs in Washington, D.C., where she utilizes data to inform strategic or policy decisions taken by governments, political campaigns, and nonprofits. She joined BlueLab Analytics after her master's in social policy and data analytics from the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to her time in the USA, she worked in India on applying data or leveraging technology for business and government clients at Orcash Services and Samagra Governance, respectively. Thanks for being here, Shweta. You're going to be talking about a role that's different from what we have covered in our videos before. So I'm really excited to have you here, and I'll let you take over.
Really happy to be here.
So can you share a bit about what experiences or concerns motivated you to pursue a career at the intersection of data and social impact? Like what particularly attracted you to this unique role, and why do you believe that it is important?
Yeah, so I think what I first kind of got clarity about was the social impact aspect of what I want to do as part of my career. And like one way that my parents used to like encourage me to think about what I want to do professionally was what are the kinds of problems that I would want to solve or dedicate my life to solving. And there it was very clear to me that it was areas like education or healthcare making a difference in society and bringing about social impact. So that was something that I knew from like a younger age, but I didn't know like how I wanted to go about it. And getting to like this intersection of data and social impact happened through both my academic and professional experiences. So I did my undergrad in economics that gave me more of an understanding of this space and the development space. And then after that, like I was working at an organization that had an analytics department, though I had like no tech background. I got exposed to what are like possible ways in which data and analytics can be used. At that time it was more in the business side of things, but I also worked on things like building dashboards at the time of natural disasters, like drawing from people's conversations on Twitter or SOS calls to kind of create a dashboard that allows us to visualize where are people struggling, where are SOS calls coming from, what are the kind of resources they need, and stuff like that. And that in fact now is like an offering that Facebook itself offers, but at that time it was like 2014, 2015. It was fairly new, and it was a process that I enjoyed, and I felt fulfilled while working on things like that. Also worked a little bit on the security side of things, deriving insights from like security and intelligence reports to make the jobs of analysts easier when they're like we were working with investigative agencies in India at that point. So these are kind of things that made me see that there are ways to use these tools and techniques, but in a manner that actually lead to helping society or helping government function better. So that's where I started to get a little bit more clarity. And then I think doing the Young India Fellowship, which gave me broader exposure to political economy and social issues, and then also working directly with government as a governance consultant, it kind of gave me a greater foundation in terms of understanding how government functions and more use cases about where data and analytics could be applied. And at that point is when I was like much more clear that this intersection is something that is both fulfilling for me, but also intellectually it stimulates me. I enjoy it. And I felt like it was something that I was good at. And that's when I decided that this is the kind of work that I want to do. And I also felt like it gives us an opportunity to be more evidence based in when we're bringing about like government programs or policies. And like analytics, I mean it's used a lot in the corporate world, but is not as used in government or nonprofit work. So I wanted to kind of be able to train myself more in that, which is why I chose to do my master's in it and try to bridge that gap and offer these services to governments and nonprofits.
That's great. And I really like the part where you mentioned that this is something that you find fulfilling and also something that you enjoy at an activity level, not just at a larger idea level, because I think that's very rare and difficult to come at. And it's great that, different parts of your past experience allowed you to arrive at this intersection, which fulfills both of those parts and helps you do the kind of work that you really like. And in terms of the field itself, data science for good is an
Mhm.
emerging field in India, right? Like it's probably more popular in the US where you are working, but data here is relatively sparse, and
Yeah.
I don't know many organizations working in this space. Would you have any organizations in mind that you have seen employing social data analysts in India?
Yeah, so what you're saying is definitely true. Data is sparse, and that's something like that we experience while working with government as well. And I think that's going to be one of the major challenges, that if we want to actually use the full capabilities of these techniques, we would have to work on actually getting that kind of data prepared. But there are still organizations that I've come across lately that are attempting to do this. So I've seen ID Insight hires data scientists and are working like using data on some of their projects to build models for targeting, or risk models for school dropouts and stuff like that they've begun to do. I've recently come across this organization called Blue Sky Analytics that's working in the environmental space. So they're working more on like the GIS side of things and building these data sets that can help solve problems of like climate change and air pollution. There are I think there's also like projects and work that goes on at like academic institutions, like at the IITs. They're attempting to solve social problems using engineering, computer science, and data. I've also come across this research initiative called Vadhwani AI, which is trying to use artificial intelligence to solve problems. I think in the healthcare space, also in the agriculture space, because agriculture has a lot of potential where you can use like satellite data to help solve problems of yield and stuff like that. So there are these initiatives that are cropping up. I've also recently actually gotten in touch with a bunch of other data professionals across India and internationally during COVID, where there have been, like local governments, district level and state level initiatives where they're asking data professionals to step in and like help them solve problems related to COVID tracking and all of that, as well as like other healthcare problems, trying to understand the functioning and efficiency of like primary healthcare centers across a district. So I think like the scope for that kind of work and the understanding of how data can play a role is increasing with time. So I'm hopeful that over the next few years, this is like a space that is going to grow further.
Right. And given what you just mentioned, it sounds like there are different ways in which data can be used and different kinds of data also, right? Like you mentioned GIS, AI,
Mhm.
engineering, etc. And I'm assuming that the different categories within roles related to data for good can also be explained probably in this way. Like there are multiple categories like data analyst, data scientist, data engineer, etc. So what are the differences between these and which one are you primarily focusing on at your current role?
Yeah, so I currently work as a data scientist, and I would say that data analyst and data scientists are not very different. Data analyst is just like the entry level position, and then you eventually grow into like a data scientist position. But both of these roles, like the main goal is to use data to derive insights from it, and so it's very focused. Like you do need to know how to code, but at the same time, you need to have like a strong statistical foundation to understand what are the statistics and machine learning techniques that can be used like to solve a particular problem and answer a particular question. So these are focused more on the statistical side of things. A data engineer usually is responsible for maintaining like the data architecture and the pipeline, where how do we process the data once we are building, say, a model? How do we actually put that into production so that it's continually, refreshed? Or how do we deliver it to a client? How do we host something? Or if we build a dashboard? So they usually tasked with more of the engineering tasks, and they usually would have a background more in software engineering and would not be focused as much on the statistics side of things. So data engineer is a slightly different position. Data analyst and data scientist are still similar. They focus more on the analysis of the data, whereas a data engineer is focused more on like managing the process and the pipelines.
And are there any roles that I'm missing out on, or any other kinds of roles at the organizations that you mentioned before?
Uh, Not really. I mean, these roles could be named different things
Hmm.
at different organizations. So you could be called like a research scientist, which would be similar to a data scientist. Usually, sometimes they require a little more expertise or like a PhD and more of a research focus in the kind of work that you end up doing. You could be called like a machine learning engineer, where it's a little bit more of a combination of writing machine learning algorithms and also working on like the engineering side of things. So sometimes it's like a combination of things, but mostly it's like these are the aspects of how you want to handle data at any organization. So these are kind of the main roles.
What work experience or skills or academic qualifications did you need to get into the role that you are at currently?
Yeah, so for me, it was mostly my master's education. Of course, my undergrad was in economics, not in like a technical domain. So my master's was in social policy and data analytics, again, at that intersection. And the data analytics side of things is where I got my data science education of how to code, statistics, machine learning, all of these things, where your coursework like focuses on that and gives you those skills. So that was definitely one aspect of it that was crucial to be able to get into a data science role. Besides that, I did have some background in analytics, like initially in my career. And so I had an understanding of these things. Though at that time I didn't code myself, but I understood like what kind of problems can be solved with this kind of data, and understood the space a little bit. And I also did some research projects on the side. I created like a data for good organization, like an initiative on campus during my master's, and worked with students or reached out to nonprofits in the local area that we work with. That gave me, the experience into working with a team on such work, and also actually figuring out how to address social problems with the kind of skills I was developing. And I did also an internship, which was also a data for social good internship. So all of that is part of like the kind of experiences that I had to go through and the skills I had to develop in order to get into this kind of role. There are also other ways. I mean, there are also these volunteer non-profits like something called Data Kind. In India, it's based in Bangalore, but in like the US, it's there in many cities that works like in this social good and data space. So they pick up projects with nonprofits and all of that, and like professionals or students can dedicate time to volunteering with them, and that gives you really great exposure. You get to work with people who have a lot more experience, so that's a great option. And there, in fact, a bunch of such nonprofits. I think there's also one called Data Analysts for Social Good. So all of that is extremely helpful in terms of getting into such roles, and research as well, like working directly with professors on these kinds of problems is definitely helpful. So for the kind of work I'm doing, politics, we focus a lot on politics as well. So a lot of my colleagues have done research in the political space, and that is something that helps them to get noticed and get selected into such a role.
I think it would be very helpful for people to know and prepare to apply for these kinds of jobs. But now going a little deeper into the role itself, can you share a little bit about what your day-to-day activities look like, and what are the kinds of larger social problems that you work on? So at a higher level as well as at a day-to-day activity level,
Yeah.
what does your work look like?
Yeah. So I work as a data scientist on the data science team where we're like a bunch of 10 colleagues, like data analysts, data scientists, senior data scientists. So we work together. Usually the way that projects are structured, they could be short term, maybe like a couple of weeks long, or they could be like longer term engagements of a few months. And the way it works is there would usually be like one or two members of the data science team tasked on a particular project depending on need. um, the kind of work that we do, so we have like a few different departments. We have like a government and civic tech team that works primarily with the federal government right now on like health insurance. So increasing like the number of people who are signing up for government health insurance in the US, and like finding ways to make that process efficient. So we like that team is analyzing where in the process of signing up are people dropping off on the website. How can we make that more efficient? How can we prevent that from happening? What is the kind of messaging that will help us reach people? So there are a lot of experiments and testing that is done on the messaging that is going out to people and stuff like that. So one aspect of it is the whole government side, and right now is primarily focused on the health insurance domain. Then we work a lot in the progressive political space. So we work with the Democratic Party, and our like the organization is dedicated to getting liberal and progressive people elected into positions of power. And so we're working with at the federal level, at the state level, at the local government level on political campaigns. So it could be like a Senate race, it could be a governor race, and we would work with that particular campaigns team in order to identify firstly who are individuals who have like a relatively high likelihood of actually coming and voting, and what kind of messaging can we send them to ensure that they actually end up going to the polls. Or it could be like who are likely swing voters who are not that rigid about which party or candidate they're voting on, that they have demonstrated that they're willing to move based on the messaging they receive. And so then like who are these individuals, and then again like how can we target them. We also do a lot of again testing of like digital campaigns and stuff. So we conduct experiments there as well on what kinds of ads are helping people move in the direction the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party. So in the political space, that is one aspect that we work on. We also work with like other organizations, like nonprofits, again, progressive nonprofits. So they could be associated with solving the problem of climate change or women's reproductive rights. So in this aspect, we're working on identifying individuals for fundraising efforts for getting donations for these nonprofits. So who are people who have the ability to donate, as well as interest in the kind of social issues that the nonprofit is working on. Also, recently I've been working on increasing like the diversity of the donor base of a particular nonprofit, because in the US it's largely like older white people who have the ability to donate, and so their donor base is largely comprised of that demographic, and they're interested in getting younger people and people of color more involved in their work. So that's like another kind of thing that we worked on. And also like resource optimization. So like when COVID hit, one of the things that we worked on was identifying firstly like food deserts in the US, so areas where there is a lack of availability of healthy food, and there are a lot of such places where for many miles you cannot access healthy food, and so people have to rely on like a McDonald's to get their meals. And that kind of creates like health issues later on. So there are nonprofits that want to set up these facilities and need to identify ideal locations for that. And also looking at the impact of COVID on the economy as well as on food insecurity, particularly child food insecurity. So the data from the government used to come in lagged. So at least there was like a 2-month lag uh, for the data to be available. And so like these nonprofits needed a way to get that information and insight much quicker so that they could intervene, especially during the beginning of the pandemic when everything was really new. It was like a totally new problem that needed to be solved. And so we worked on stuff like that at that point. Um, so those are usually, yeah, like the government and nonprofit space. And we've also worked a little bit on policy. So things like analyzing what is the effect of certain laws. So right now we've been working on like voter suppression laws. So there's been a lot of legislation that like certain states in the US with like the Republican Party in power have come up with to try to reduce the number of people who actually end up voting because that usually ends up in their favor. And so like we're kind of analyzing using data what is the effect of these voter suppression laws. There are a bunch of different kinds of ways in which you can suppress voting. And so looking at like how much does that really suppress voter turnout and which ones, you know, have more of an effect versus the others and stuff like that. So a little bit of that as well. We do have like a few corporate clients, and we also work extensively in like surveys and polling in that kind of space as well. So that's another aspect of the work we do because that is what helps us like gather data about the way people think and feel about things. But primarily those are the kinds of projects. And so to do these, the tools that I'm like ending up using on a regular basis would be SQL. Working with databases is like very important. And besides that, for the analysis aspect of things, it's usually Python and R that I end up using for these different kinds of projects. A lot of them are on identifying individuals and targeting them. So we end up building models for that. Sometimes it could be, for example, like the food insecurity and economic impact, where you want to do a little bit of forecasting. There you would use like time series analysis. There have been times, for example, identifying food deserts. There you use a little bit more of GIS techniques in order to identify such regions. So it's usually like a mixed bag of different statistical and machine learning techniques. And that's also like constantly growing because you're constantly faced with new problems. So that's definitely one aspect of this kind of profession. Data science in general, I think, whether it's social good or not, is a vastly growing domain. And so you always have to kind of keep learning, keep studying research, and like learning new techniques because it's always evolving.
Wow, that's a large variety of work, right? I mean, based on what you said, I can already see a few different things that came up in the kind of work that you are doing at one organization, be it like insights for civic interventions or influencing behavior change or targeting the right demographic from a voter or funder perspective or surveys or things like that. But basically, it's just very vast, the kind of work that you're doing. And I'm sure that outside of your organization, with considering the different kinds of things that people are doing, the opportunities would be even more to
Mhm.
use data for good. And all of what you covered are things that you are doing as a part of your current position as a data scientist,
Yeah.
which I'm assuming is a mid-career position of sorts.
Mhm.
Um, would you know what the growth path looks like for someone who's keen to pursue this at a senior level?
Yeah, I mean, so usually there are like two ways that you could go. So one is to go into like a more of a managerial role, where as you gain experience, like experience is definitely a huge advantage in this space because it's so broad, like you can never know everything, and the more you work, the more problems you work on, the more techniques you use, you just become that much more of an asset. So in that kind of role, then you would kind of do less of the work yourself and you will be more in charge of managing a team of analysts and scientists and guiding them in terms of approaching analysis on problems like this. So that is one option. And the other is usually when you really enjoy the work yourself and you want to like continue doing that, then as you gain expertise, you could, you know, choose to focus your attention on like a particular problem and become an expert in that. A lot of people go into like deeper research on particular problems, so that's another option where you would kind of be given, you know, your own department to conduct research and development and develop solutions to solve a particular problem that you have developed expertise in. So you could go either way. If you're more interested in the managerial aspect of things, you could go down that road. Or if you want to like continue to dedicate your life to like a particular problem and go deeper into it, you could do that as well.
Do you have any advice for how students and young professionals can gain the necessary skills for this role, both at an entry level and to grow through the ranks?
Uh, the necessary skills, I mean, so now there are a lot of engineering courses, of course, at like the undergrad and master's level. So in fact, I would say like from my experience while I was doing my master's, no matter what kind of engineering course people were doing, if it was mechanical or electrical or anything, they were always taking electives in data science and machine learning. And a lot of them end up working either as like software engineer, like machine learning engineers or data scientists as well, even from that kind of background. So when you're doing engineering, like now increasingly people are moving in this direction, no matter what kind of engineering department they go into initially. If you're not an engineer, if you don't already have like technical skills, then I think one option is definitely to begin to learn these things on your own. And that's actually something that I did initially when I started to realize that this is something I enjoy. I would do like online courses and at work try to find opportunities to actually apply what I was learning and you know try to pick up those skills. But I think like a formal education in data science always helps because it is a very broad domain and it like it's not necessarily that easy to pick up on your own. So there are options like boot camps. If you've already done like your undergrad or masters and you don't want to like invest another 2 years into something, then going into like a data science boot camp, that would give you the skills that you need to be able to work as a data scientist. Otherwise, like pursuing a formal education in this space would definitely be useful. Besides that, internships and volunteering, like I mentioned, like those kinds of organizations that let you work on projects with teams of people who have like more experience than you do. There is a lot to learn working with people. It's also like quite a collaborative space because like it's so vast. It's impossible for one person to have all the answers and always know what is the right way to do something. So having a team to work with is a huge advantage, to be able to talk through approaches, learn from one another. That's like a huge part of, you know, being successful and continuing to grow and learn in this space. So I would say that like giving focus to that is definitely important. But usually, yeah, these would be the ways to get into data science specifically. And the social good aspect of it, there are some people who come from like a purely data science and engineering background and don't have that much exposure to the social good, like policy side of things. I feel like that has like its advantages, you know, to have that interdisciplinary sort of education helps in my opinion, because I feel like there are ways that you think from like a social science perspective that is very different from your engineering and analytics sort of thinking. And I think both are important and have their own place. So getting that exposure, if you don't get that like as part of your formal education, then like reading a lot. There are books out there like that talk about application of data science in these fields that would be useful to continually get exposure to the social science perspective towards social good and data science and stuff like that. So I think that's also important. Like the kind of experience I had, like I studied a few classes at engineering school when I was doing my master's, and I felt like there's a little bit of that kind of social consciousness missing in the approach to teaching that I saw there. Like we had this professor who used this image during our classes. So there's this image called Lena that has been used historically for like image processing tasks and stuff. And it's basically like a 1970s picture of a woman from Playboy magazine. And at that point, it was largely like a male dominated domain. And since then, they've just been using this picture for their tasks and all of that. And I mean, now it's like there is much more public opinion that talks about how that is inappropriate and can make women in the classroom feel uncomfortable. But like our professor, I think he knew that, but he still went ahead and used it, and without really thinking too much about how are you making people feel in the classroom. So also had like another professor use data that was collected unethically. I think it was like leaked data that had like personally identifiable information in it, and he didn't really think about the consequences of that. Whereas I think that if you had like a professor from like a policy school from a social science background, those would definitely be things that they would bother them, that they would question before putting that into use. So it's, I think, important to get those perspectives about the ethics of things and thinking about problems from that perspective as well, that help you work at this sort of intersection. So I would say like get exposure for this technical skills. Yes, you need to know data science, but in terms of how to approach problems, I think it is definitely helpful to get a social science perspective in as well.
And you mean that only in terms of the ethical practices or the methods of going about this, or even the strength of problem solving and the kind of insights that one might generate?
Yeah, I think in that department as well. So when you are working on a problem, like understanding the domain is a huge, huge advantage. And I mean, I wouldn't say like I'm an expert in every domain that I'm working in. I'm working on a wide variety of problems, but I have to spend time to educate myself to really understand the domain to enable me to like be create good models. So for example, if I'm working on politics, I need to have an understanding of the political space, what kind of people tend to be more liberal, what kind of people tend to be more conservative, and being able to like identify those patterns. If I didn't understand that, then I wouldn't be able to, it would be more trial and error where I'm like throwing variables into a model and hoping something works and trying to figure it out. But there's a lot of understanding that goes into actually doing this work successfully. And the ethical aspect of it is definitely important. So thinking about what you're doing, what are the implications, how is this going to impact people, is there a disproportionate impact on certain communities or not, that is also important. And that kind of thinking is also like usually not something that you get exposed to when you're doing purely analytics or like a data science education.
What I wanted to ask next is kind of related to what you just mentioned and covered, but do you have any other insights, or what have been your biggest surprises that you think people should know about while looking at this as a potential career? Something that you learned later on, but you think people should know going in?
Yeah, I think there are a few things. One is like when I got into this, I was approaching social impact pretty narrowly, to be honest. Like I was only thinking about it in terms of government and policy, and I didn't really look at the nonprofit space as an opportunity as much for like social good and data, or even some of the work that there are for-profit organizations that are working on, but yeah, that I wasn't looking at as relevant opportunities for me. So I think broadening that scope and perspective that with which you're looking at how you can have an impact is something that I learned over time. The other is definitely this aspect of the ethics and challenges. So not all kinds of uses of data and analysis of data are necessarily ethically correct. And that's something that we've begun to see a lot more. We've like heard about the use of facial recognition for policing and how that has been recorded to be racially biased. There's in fact like a really good documentary on Netflix on this called Coded Bias, in case like there are people who are interested. So now, in fact, there are cities in the US that are preventing the use of facial recognition tech, which was initially, it just sounds like super advanced and cool, and people want to implement that. But there are consequences of using these kind of techniques, right? Because they are based on data that is available out in society, and that data tends to be biased because society is biased, and that bias then kind of gets encoded into the these sorts of tools and techniques that you are using to make decisions. And it's important to be able to identify that, and where it's inappropriate, it should not be used. So there's this new domain of algorithmic auditing that is actually developing now, where your algorithms are assessed for bias. So, for example, there was this case where there are algorithms that are used to determine what is the risk of recidivism amongst incarcerated individuals. And it was found again to be biased. That was giving higher risk scores to African Americans, even those who had much like more minor crimes as compared to white people with more like major crimes. So what an algorithmic auditing sort of professional would do is like once you have built a model, it will actually look at how accurate are you for different communities. So there could be gender bias, there could be bias based on people's sexuality, race, religion. And so the process would look at how well is your solution actually performing for different communities. So in the facial recognition case, it was found that the algorithm is extremely accurate when it comes to white men, but it's pretty inaccurate and makes a lot of mistakes when it comes to African American women. And so do you actually want to put that into use, or should it be allowed because it's making a bunch of decisions that have like a real impact on human beings? So this is a space that is important for data scientists to kind of constantly be engaging with the ethics of what they're doing. And that begins from how are you collecting this data? Did you ask for consent when you collected this data? Do people know how the data is being used? All the way down to once you've created a solution, what is the impact it's having, and is that disproportionate or not? And so no matter like what role you're working in as a data scientist, always, I mean, important to keep asking yourself these questions. It's a growing domain, and there's like a lot of research happening, and there are new techniques that are coming out. But yeah, that's important to not just blindly go in assuming that there's data, so let's analyze it and let's put it to use. But it's important to look at how are we actually doing that and what impact is it having on people. So yeah, that's one. And I think the other is just the fact that it's very, very vast as a domain. So there is a lot of imposter syndrome amongst people working in the data science space, because you always feel inadequate. There's like always someone who knows something that you don't know. It's important to continually learn and grow, but it's also important to identify that it's just not possible for you to know everything. Just keep working, keep reading and learning new techniques and just like enjoy the process and not compare yourself necessarily to different people, because people have spent their time on different kinds of problems and have experience with different things, but so do you. So yeah, I think those are probably a few of the things that I've learned along the way.
Thanks, Shweta. All extremely wise pieces of advice, and I'm glad we got to hear that. Before we conclude, do you have any parting thoughts for students or young professionals navigating the development sector in general?
Uh, I mean, one is just like I find it to be very fulfilling work. So, I mean, there are trade offs to working in the development sector. You know that maybe you're not going to earn at the same level as people working in like traditionally corporate sort of role, even if you're working as a data scientist. That kind of a little bit of disparity is going to be there, but it gives you the opportunity to work on really challenging problems. I feel like the more complex problems that are to do with education or health and stuff like that, which involve bringing in a variety of disciplines to be able to address these problems. It's not that clear cut or
And they have not
simple.
been solved before, also, probably.
Exactly. They remain unsolved, and yeah, and is an opportunity to have impact at a huge scale when you're working with government. So if you're somebody who is moved by these sorts of issues, who is civically engaged, and is interested in making a difference, I feel like getting into this work is will always kind of give you satisfaction in terms of you having the kind of impact you want from your life and your career. And I also think that you meet a lot of wonderful people in this kind of work who share the same values as you and have the same concerns, like want to do work that actually help people. So it's a great community to be a part of as well. So yeah, that's just one aspect of working in this kind of space that I really love and enjoy. And that's what like keeps me going, even though sometimes you might feel like people might be ahead in the corporate world and all of that, but keeping in mind that this is fulfilling work, and a lot of times that's not easy to find. So that's definitely one thing. And other than that, not just the development sector, I think just generally young people getting into work, I would say one thing it's important to keep in mind is just like having work-life balance is really important. The culture is not there as yet. You're expected to work insane hours, and like the work is your life sort of thing, which it shouldn't be. I think we all have like different kinds of interests. We want to volunteer our time on problems that we can't work on when we're at work. We want to like, pursue interests and all of that. It's important to keep doing that as well to kind of continually feel refreshed and fulfilled, because like work is not everything. And I don't think anything is so urgent that working 5 more hours a day rather than like 8 hours is just gonna like change everything. So I think like finding opportunities to keep that work-life balance is another thing that I would just encourage people.
Thank you so much, Shweta. I learned a lot myself, and I'm glad that you were here to help more people know about this unique role and the kind of work that they can do at the intersection of data and social good. This is also something that I think is gradually growing in India in terms of importance as well as opportunities. So I'm really happy that we could do this, and thank you so much for your time and very wise advice throughout.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.